I'd like to introduce to you Mr. Gunnar Beck. He's a lecturer in law who's lectured in Britain in law for a long time, and he's also a member of the European Parliament, an MEP for the AfD, which is the Alternative for Deutschland party in the last term. And I would like to say very welcome to Westport, very welcome to Ireland. It's not your first time.
No, it's not my first time, and thank you very much, Hermann.
Yeah. With your experience of lockdowns across Europe and in Germany, and you've seen the situation in Ireland, what do you think is going on with the lockdown? What are the problems with the COVID lockdown?
Well, I think the obvious impression one gets from travelling throughout Europe is really, when are these ever going to end? Because there seems no end in sight. It's been going on for a year and a half now. All the statistics suggest that the number of COVID hospitalizations and deaths have decreased significantly, and yet we're talking about further lockdowns. Besides, when it comes to wearing masks, that doesn't seem to be ending at all. So the question is, when will we ever return to normality? And there's no clear indication given by any of the governments throughout the European Union.
And what do you think of the introduction of a COVID passport, as they call it, a passport? It seems to be more like a restriction on people's ability to travel and to go to work.
Well, it's
go into
clear.
Shops.
Well, before these passports, or as the EU first called them, digital COVID certificates were introduced, we were told that there be no discrimination whatsoever between those who choose to get vaccinated and those who don't. Now the situation that emerges is a very different one. Of course, the passport allows you, well, the passport contains various bits of information. One is whether you've recovered from COVID and therefore possess post-illness immunity, whether you've been vaccinated or whether you've had a test during the last 24 to 72 hours. Now, you can travel and do most things in each of these cases, but what it effectively means is that those who've chosen not to get vaccinated will have to get a test in future, most likely to be at their own exclusive expense, every time they wish to board a plane, every time they wish to cross a border, and in many cases, in many European countries, in many cases when they wish to enter a restaurant. So effectively, you have very considerable indirect discrimination, and it applies to those who've been infected with COVID as well, because the assumption made here is that post-COVID immunity will only last for about 6 months. The reality, however, is that many people who've been vaccinated get infected, so that justification for these certificates and for according privileged treatment to the vaccinated seems a very slim one indeed.
Yeah, and really in Ireland, it's one of the most draconian. The Irish government has imposed one of the most draconian lockdown regimes in the whole of Europe. It's one of the longest running. It has had massive consequences, one for people's civil liberties, to go to work, to go to the shops, to travel. At the moment, 24% of the general population are currently unemployed. 59% of people under 24 are unemployed in Ireland. And the financial consequences of running up huge debt is going to have long-term consequences for not only this generation, but the next. But that's on the lockdown and the attack on our civil liberties. The idea that the government gives freedom to citizens is, I think, a very dangerous precedent. Well, just during this last week, there's been a rash of articles on RTE and programs on RTE, the Irish National, the state broadcaster basically, that there's been a lot of articles about climate change and about the latest UN IPCC report. And what do you think of the idea that people are suggesting that COVID lockdown will be like a template to introduce? It could possibly in the future be used as a template to introduce lockdowns to combat what they call climate change, or what they used to call global warming.
Yes, well, it certainly set a precedent, and what governments will have found is that although there's growing dissatisfaction, there's not been decisive resistance. So the lesson they will draw from the last 1.5 years is that albeit people may be disgruntled, and although it may have devastating effects, and you've highlighted them, psychological on individual people in terms of the effects on individual lives, elderly people being effectively isolated during the final stages of their lives in many cases. Although it has devastating economic consequences, public indebtedness has gone up by about 10% in the course of a little over a year. The effect on public finances is catastrophic. And thirdly, I think, and that's very important and links up with your latest question, people are getting used to the idea that there are a whole host of liberties that they do not enjoy as a matter of course, but which government will grant them or withhold from them depending on their compliance with a government decreed code of behavior. That idea has certainly been inculcated in people over the last 1.5 years. What we've already seen in the media is a steady stream of articles asserting a kind of a beneficial effect of lockdowns on global warming and CO2 emissions. So my suspicion, as I suspect your suspicion, is that in future what we'll see will be sort of temporary lockdowns every year to tie down people, the justification being that that's central to reducing CO2 emissions. So that will be a kind of institutionalization of the very bad effects of the lockdown that we've witnessed during the COVID period. So we are probably, I fear, entering a phase of ever increasing government regulation of our daily lives, and that many things we've taken for granted will now be exceptional and conditional on on compliance with certain rules of socially desirable behaviour.
Yeah, the situation in Ireland is incredible. Reading over the last month that there was Ireland came very close to a power shortage in January of this year. There is in the news today that they are seeking planning permission for a large data centre in Ennis in County Clare. At the moment, this is where currently there are 66 data centres in Ireland. There are planning permission granted already for an additional 44. Now, EirGrid tell us that 29% of all Irish energy will be going to these data centres by the end of this decade. And so a huge, you wonder, who is Ireland's energy for? Who is it? Is it for the benefit of the Irish people or for these global corporations that are headquartered and have their data centres here? But the whole thing about this IPCC report, now I think it would be a note that there's Dr. Patrick Moore, who is co-founder of Greenpeace, and that he has explicitly said that he does not believe that man-made CO2 emissions are the dominant factor in the increase in global temperatures over the last number of hundreds of years. Sorry, last 150 years since the Industrial Revolution. CO2, so this is like the big boogeyman. Now, I think there is a problem in that it is distracting. The whole CO2 monomania, as we may put it, is a distraction from real visible problems of loss of biodiversity, pollution of our waterways, loss of insect life, loss of various species, lack of nutrition and food in the sea, for example, for salmon, in which I'm very interested, as some of our viewers may be aware. But that this monomania, this concentration on CO2, we had a thing there during the week where Cork Council were paying €350,000 a pop for these metal metal trees, which would filter out CO2 and tell you pollution readings, like instead of, well, just growing trees. Because I'm sure, like myself, you were brought up in school and you were taught that CO2 as a gas is necessary for photosynthesis and that CO2 is good for plants. What do you think on the whole scientific thing about CO2, its relation to greening the planet and photosynthesis? Is it plant food? Is CO2, is it intrinsically a bad substance that we should be afraid of? What do you think?
Well, as in your case, I mean, photosynthesis is probably the one thing I remember from my most vividly from my biology lessons at school. Incidentally, I share your passion about salmon. I'm less concerned about insect life, perhaps. But let's return to the main point here. As you said, what the media, NGOs, lots of other government-sponsored organizations united under the umbrella of the International Panel on Climate Change, all publicly funded, and in consequence and in reliance on that publicly funded evidence, unisono, all the Western governments are asserting, is a dominant, critical connection between CO2 emissions and the rise in world temperatures that we are told we've witnessed since the onset of the Industrial Revolution. Now, I'm no scientist to evaluate this hypothesis, but it is, after all, just a hypothesis. There are alternative explanations of climate change, which, according to some of these rival theses, have to do with far more long-term phenomena than CO2 emissions. And there are a number of facts which I think it is important to bear in mind, which cast doubt on the official truth propounded by seemingly everyone who's got a public platform now. One is, let me just focus on a few. One is that if we look back onto the Earth's history, changes in temperature have been normal and not the exception. There is, on an historical, from an historical perspective, and when I say historical here, we are not talking about the kind of 3,000 years.
You're talking over millennia.
Over millennia, over millions of years, really. I mean, there have been constant changes in the Earth's atmospheric temperature, changes which at various points have been vastly more significant than the one we've witnessed over the last 150 to 200 years. During the Permian period, for example, and we are now going back millions of years, temperatures apparently were about 10 degrees Celsius higher than they are now. By comparison, the increase in temperature that most publicly funded, and therefore practically all scientists are alleging now we've witnessed since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, that hovers around estimates ranging from something like 0.6 degrees Celsius to around 1.1 degrees Celsius, so a relatively small change. A second fact, as I indicated, during the Permian period, the Earth's temperatures were far, far higher than those we have now, but apparently CO2, atmospheric CO2 concentrations, carbon dioxide concentrations, were significantly lower than they are now. So that would suggest that there is no clear correlation between
causation.
What we may find now is a so-called contiguity in the rise of CO2 emissions or CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere and a moderate rise in temperature. But that doesn't establish a causation. So one has to neatly differentiate between the two. So these are very important facts. I mean, I said I'd mention three, but those two, I think, cast doubt on the official hypothesis. Let me now turn to the final one I wanted to mention, namely that we've seen a very significant, that goes back to your point about photosynthesis. As a result of the increase in CO2 emissions, which I'm not disputing, we are seeing a significant increase in vegetation all over the world. The world today is much greener than it was decades ago. So in parallel,
I think it's NASA has.
Indeed, I mean, it's been confirmed even by NASA. And the effect of increased vegetation is that it dampens the increase in atmospheric temperatures. Now, that leads me to my final point, namely a very interesting study by the Technical University in Zurich, which has found that if we reforest around 10% of the Earth's surface, which is perfectly possible, and thereby the area covered by forests by about by just under a third, that would, over a relatively short period of time, absorb all the extra CO2 emissions that we've allegedly seen since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So that seems the obvious solution to our problem, if indeed there is a problem, and if the official explanation given for it is correct. My question is, why isn't anyone talking about this kind of remedy which would not force us to industrialize? So the suggestion here is
deindustrialize as well.
Which would not force us to abandon our current way of life and introduce a process of massive deindustrialization, which the German government is currently engaged in. So that suggests that, maybe there are other explanations.
Yeah, I think the COVID lockdown has shown the dangerous relationship between government funding and scientific explanations. The shutting down of alternative viewpoints, closing down of bringing forward of evidence to bring points in regards to COVID, about treatments and things like that. And I think it does the same about the IPPC report. There's been people have mentioned the shutting down of alternative viewpoints and that alternative explanations. But I'd like to take up the point that you raised about, I think they are taking out to prove their point just the last 150 years. But if you look at global temperatures and CO2 concentrations over many, many millennia, that global temperatures have been much higher and much lower than they are at the moment, and CO2 levels have been much higher and much lower than they are at the moment. And over a very, very long period of time, over these many millennia, I don't see that there's been proof of a causation effect that CO2 levels have changed, been able to change the climate. Now, by just taking the very short window since the Industrial Revolution, they may have a point, but even at that, it's acknowledged that in the 15 years since 1998, there has been no significant global warming in that period. So I don't think they've been able to prove a causal relationship between CO2 levels and global temperatures over many millennia. And second point is that the explanation of global temperatures, there's a Serbian scientist, Milankovitch, born in the late 19th century, and basically his thesis, which was only proven by data really in the 1970s, taking proxies of temperature and CO2 concentrations, that his thesis was that global variations in global temperature are dominantly affected by the Earth's relationship with the sun. There's 3 cycles he talks about the ellipse around the sun, then oscillation of the Earth in relation to the sun. And well, his thesis was proven correct and accepted by scientists in the 1970s. So I think that it may be, and I think we should be open to alternative viewpoints and explanations, that proximity to the sun and hotspots on the sun could well be the dominant factor which causes global warming, and that whereas greenhouse gas effect does have an effect, it's certainly not the dominant effect. Proposals from the UN, it's really kind of, I wouldn't say Luddite, but very anti-industrial, but closing down industry. In Ireland, I spoke at the very start about coming very close to power shortages. At the same time, they're shutting down this year 2 power plants in the Midlands, which were just built because they burned peat, turf, and that so they're doing this at the same time. They're vast, as you've seen in the west of Ireland now, a vast array of wind turbine farms, which are ugly, are expensive, are subsidised, always have to have a backup of coal or gas. But even what they suggest for the West, like for Ireland, what Ireland must do to overcome this CO2 production, do you think it'll have much of an effect? Because you've got large developing countries like India and China, and will what the West does really make a difference anyway, even if we accept the thesis that man-made CO2 is the specific and dominant factor in global warming?
Yes, a thesis which it's worth emphasizing yet again has not been proven, because, as you said previously, what no one's been able to establish yet is a causal connection between rises or falls in temperature and CO2 emissions over a very long period of time. So that suggests that perhaps the scientists of the IPCC, all the advocates of drastic climate change action, have been very clever in choosing the date with reference to which they are measuring rises in temperature and rises in CO2 emissions. That's generally broadly the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, whenever precisely that was. But as you also rightly said, if we look at temperature changes over the last 20 years, what in fact we are observing is that there have been roughly comparable oscillations above and below the sort of medium temperature of 14 degrees. So some years, over the last 20 years, it's been warmer, sometimes noticeably warmer, and on others, and roughly the same number of years, it's been colder or significantly colder. So there's not been a sustained rise over that time. So, well, you can establish any sort of semblance of correlation if you choose your starting and end points very wisely. But now back to your second point, because that is a very crucial one. Let's assume, just for the sake of the argument, that which hasn't been proven, namely a correlation or causal connection between CO2 emissions and temperatures. Well, then what are the climate change activists, the climate rescue activists, suggesting? They are suggesting, as indeed the IPCC was or did in its latest report, drastic action. Unless we act now and take drastic action, which essentially means almost deindustrialization, then everything will become irreversible and it'll be a huge Armageddon. Well, let's just look.
And actually, the UN has been shouting apocalypse now about global climate for the last 50 years. So they actually haven't changed. Sometimes they change their explanation, but they haven't changed the main thing about climate alarmism. They've been at it actually since early 1970s. And now they're saying, you may have seen about, we've got 12 years, apocalypse now, we've got 12 years to save the planet or else.
Well, for about 50 years, we've been various bodies, starting with the Club of Rome, asserting that we'll run out of the world's natural resources within a matter of 20 or 30 years. So we've been subjected to alarmist predictions about the end of the world for the last 60 years, always on assumptions then thrown overboard by subsequent developments. Take, for example, the predictions about the world's natural resources. Those were based on a population rises much smaller than the one we've actually witnessed, and yet we haven't seen the end of the world.
That's in relation to the kind of neo-Malthusian theory about relationship between population and food production.
Well, that's true. So far, these
which has been proven incorrect every generation since he came up with the idea.
True, although it doesn't necessarily establish either that the population should be continued to increase at present levels. That does give rise to problems. But let's look at, say, recommendations, namely drastic reductions in CO2 emissions. Now, of course, the only body of countries that's likely to follow and scrupulously follow those recommendations are those of the West, namely Western Europe, including here not only the EU but also Great Britain, possibly North America, and then perhaps the odd country here and there. Now, take the EU. The EU, according to various estimates, is responsible for something like 6.5 to 9% of all CO2 emissions. Germany, the principal industrial economy of the EU, is responsible for less than 2% of the world's CO2 emissions. The United States will be higher, but again, maybe something like 15%, although I do not have the precise figures at our fingertips. Let's focus, therefore, at the European Union. So the European Union is now proposing drastic climate change action. It wants to reduce its emissions by about 55% by 2030. It aims to be climate neutral, whatever that precisely means, by 2050. But what we also see right now are drastic increases in emissions in the newly industrialized countries, especially China. China's just announced the building of 180 new airports, whereas Europe seems to be committed to the idea that the means of transport of the future is the bicycle. Right, so China's moved from bicycles to aircraft. We seem to be moving from aircraft to bicycles. But if we are responsible for less than 10%, and indeed between 6.5% to 9% of the world's CO2 emissions, then anything we do, which will almost in any case significantly impoverish us, will be more than offset by what's happening in China alone. So what is the point of all this? We don't know whether there's a clear correlation between CO2 emissions and temperatures, but what we do know is that anything we can do and which will drastically change our lives will have absolutely zero effect on the world climate. Well, in these circumstances, I suggest it be far more rational to try to adapt to rises in world temperature, assuming, which is by no means certain, that these will continue, than to engage in fights against windmills, which is what the European Commission seems to be doing right now. Yeah. We are gearing our entire economy to climate change objectives, which we know will be meaningless and fruitless in their effects, because we cannot control what China is doing. And what I said about China more or less applies to other economies such as India too.
Yes, that's very, very interesting. And like the Irish Freedom Party, which I'm president, we kind of, just like you suggested there, we think it's a very good idea for the large-scale plantation of native deciduous forests. And Ireland used to be the most heavily forested country in Europe. Now it's one of the most deforested. So there's certainly room in Ireland for that, as if we believe that photosynthesis is good for vegetation and plant growth and giving out of oxygen. Well, forestation is a great move. For the Irish Freedom Party, we also suggest looking at, certainly when the technology improves, that there should be 2 state commissions to look at and investigate the benefits and drawbacks and the costs and efficiency of both tidal energy, because we're an island surrounded by the sea. We believe that technology hasn't been utilised sufficiently. I think it needs more research and to be investigated, and also to be open and to investigate, has the safety and the efficiency of nuclear energy been sufficiently looked at in the Irish context? Because with energy shortages coming up and the closure of, say, peat and oil and gas power plants, well, where is Ireland going to get its energy from? But it's very eye-opening what you say about the relationship between CO2 and global temperatures. And even if we accept, which I don't, I believe in climate change. Climate has always changed, has always changed, and will always change. It's a natural phenomenon. But that even if we accept their premise and act upon it, that the impact of Europe and America doing this will be very insignificant because of what is happening in China and India and other developing countries.
Well, in this whole debate, I think...
And the worrying aspect is carrying on where we started about the COVID lockdown, and are we approaching what could be lockdowns justified with apocalypse now and climate alarmism?
The only thing we know in this whole debate about climate change and what remedies may, if there are any indeed, capable of containing it, is that whatever the West does will have absolutely no effect. That's the only real thing we know in this whole debate, because the dominant thesis about the causal connection between temperatures and CO2 emissions has not been proven. Well, I think what may be instructive here, because I'm not sufficiently familiar with the situation in Ireland. I'm more familiar with the situation in Germany, but you've raised two very interesting points, namely one about wind turbines, and the second was about nuclear energy.
Energy and nuclear energy.
Indeed, yes. Well, I think Germany's recent energy policy is very instructive on this. Take nuclear energy after the Fukushima disaster around 10 years ago, also, I believe.
Yeah.
Mrs. Merkel immediately announced a decision to phase out all nuclear energy. Germany at the time, well, interestingly, in 2005, she had campaigned on a platform to reintroduce nuclear energy. Germany at that time had the most modern nuclear plants in the world. It was an export success as well, compared to the nuclear plants in all the adjoining countries. The German ones were universally acknowledged to be the most modern ones. So Germany is now in the process of phasing out its last nuclear power stations. After Fukushima, Mrs. Merkel decided, well, if there's a danger of a tsunami, and if it could lead to a nuclear shutdown in Japan, which incidentally hasn't had the catastrophic effect it initially threatened to have, well then there's just the same danger in Germany, although, how remote or realistic is the chance of a tsunami in Germany.
Yeah.
So basically, Germany, with the most modern nuclear energy technology in the world, forsook reliance on that source of energy. And what we've seen as a result is that the whole country is now covered in wind turbines. Well, what are the effects of those? Well, effectively, the whole country, the countryside's been blighted. If you travel from Düsseldorf, my hometown, to Berlin by train, well, you first traverse the Ruhr area. There are no wind turbines there, but as soon as you get onto clear plains, it's wind turbines all the way to Berlin. Wow. And there are lots of them in the North Sea now, but there have been legal wranglings about the pipelines down to Bavaria. So most of these wind turbines in the north of Germany are working all right, but they aren't connected to any consumers of technology. So basically they're kept running just in order to prevent or slow down their decay, but they're not producing any energy. And what you noted about Ireland is true of Germany as well. There have been energy shortages at several points. So what we do in these cases is to rely on importing nuclear energy from the surrounding countries, in particular France. So, what was the point of phasing out nuclear energy in Germany if on a fairly regular scale we need to import foreign nuclear energy? Yeah. So none of this adds up. And the overall effect in terms of energy savings, climate change, seems non-existent.
Yeah. Very good. Well, I think the discussion here today is hopefully it gives people at home some food for thought to think, and for yourselves to go and research more on the debate that is taking place, and to make sure that the debate and with alternative evidence and viewpoints carries on, and that we should examine alternative both explanations of what is taking place in regards global climate change. Look at the causes and also what are the consequences of the solutions proffered by the UN. Will they be effective? And ultimately, how the countries of Ireland and Germany, for example, how we should prepare going forward to provide energy for our people, which is very, very important. So thank you very much, Gunnar. Great to see you in Ireland again, and you'd be very welcome. And thank you for having the discussion with me today.
Thank you, Hermann. Good luck to the Irish Freedom Party. Good luck to all of us, the voices of reason, and let's hope we'll have the onset, we'll experience this prospect of the onset of the new age of reason, because in many respects we live in the dark ages now.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For my answer.